Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here, and today I have another history themed video for you. So, of course, I am Scottish and my group IRFA are based in Edinburgh in Scotland. And this means that people are sometimes surprised when I explain that I train in and teach an Italian style of Renaissance swordsmanship. And so, naturally enough, from time to time, I get asked questions like, well, did people do fencing in Renaissance Scotland? And if they did, what type of fencing was it that they were doing? So the first of these two questions is easy enough to answer. Yes, of course, people practiced fencing in Renaissance era Scotland. There were swords everywhere in Renaissance era Europe, and of course people wanted to train how to use them. The second question, what type of fencing was practiced here, is not so easy to answer, and it's really going to be the theme of today's video. If you say Scottish swordsman to the average person, they will probably immediately think of an image like this one, of tartan-clad warriors charging into battle, wielding basket-hilted broadswords and protected by a type of round shield called a targe. This sort of figure is absolutely part of our martial history. However, it is typical of the late 17th and 18th century. This particular painting was executed in the mid-18th century. While this is absolutely an authentic image, it doesn't tell us anything about the Renaissance, about the 16th century. So we need to move away from this kind of picture in our analysis. So let's talk about fencing treatises. There are a number of surviving fencing treatises written and published in Scotland. The earliest of which were written by Sir William Hope and Donald MacBain, two masters which are widely known, I think, in the modern historical fencing community. So the very earliest works were by William Hope. Unfortunately, they also date from the late 17th century. So images like this one and the text which accompany it are once again no use at all in trying to decipher what was going on in the 16th century. So unfortunately, there just aren't any fencing treatises from our period of interest. So we need to turn now to secondary sources in our efforts to understand what was happening. However, a little bit of historical background first. Although a romanticised or Hollywood view of Scotland in this period might portray it as a kind of savage backward land on the fringes of civilization, in fact Scotland was a kingdom very much part of a wider European civilization or society, if you like. Scotland had strong connections with its southern neighbour, England, of course, and these vacillated between cordial relations and outright hostility. And this flip in relations happened several times throughout the course of the 16th century. So England was certainly one source of influence on Scotland. However, Scotland was allied to France for a large part of our period through the so-called Auld Alliance. So that was a political and military alliance between the kingdoms. And after the religious reformation of the mid-16th century, there were a lot of connections established between Scotland and other northern European Protestant nations, particularly the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and some of the North German territories. So it's important to understand that what was happening in Scotland, socially, politically, and martially, was not happening in isolation. It was part of what was happening across the European continent. So I'm going to turn now to this excellent book for some information. This is Swords for Hire, The Scottish Mercenary by James Miller. I strongly recommend this. It's a really good read. So essentially this book focuses on the numerous Scots who left their homeland to go and fight for money in other parts of Europe. With a particular focus on the 16th and 17th centuries, which is essentially our period of interest. The most important thing to realise is simply that this was happening. So there were people regularly moving between Scotland and other parts of Europe as soldiers, as warriors, and they were taking their ideas of combat with them from home, but also being influenced by what was happening in the countries where they campaigned. This image, which I've borrowed from the book, is of two Scottish ensigns, so soldiers in Germany somewhere. I can't remember exactly where, but it's not important. And these are from the late 16th century. Note the rather extreme difference from the Highland clansmen of the 18th century that we saw earlier. And in particular, you should note that they are wearing typical fashionable 16th century clothes of the type that were worn across Western Europe. And from a martial point of view, note that both of them are carrying swept-hilted swords, possibly rapiers, slung low at their left hips. So in other words, these basically look like 16th century Europeans. There's nothing in terms of appearance about them which is uniquely Scottish. Meanwhile, back in Scotland, this rather splendid portrait is of George Lord Seaton. It was executed in 1577. So this aristocrat was an important member of the court of Mary, Queen of Scots. So, what can we see about the picture? He's wearing an extremely fashionable and rather expensive looking suit of Renaissance clothing, of the sort which wouldn't be out of place in France or even Italy. And once again, note at his left hip there is slung a rapier. And in the background we can see some typical plate armour, as would have been worn by aristocratic heavy cavalry soldiers at this time. So just like those mercenary soldiers in northern Germany, this man is wearing clothing and weaponry which is typical of Western Europe. There's nothing here which really bears any resemblance to the 18th century tartan-clad clansmen which we saw earlier on. Okay, this next image is actually a modern illustration from a history book of the Battle of Linlithgow Bridge in 1526. So this was part of a short civil war in Scotland. Obviously it's from the earlier part of the Renaissance, but is still broadly within our time period. And the way the soldiers are portrayed is based on written sources from the period. So we can see that, again, they look broadly European, with a few local touches. But in terms of the equipment they're wearing, pretty standard body armour and helmets for Western European infantry, and the weapons they're equipped with are a mixture of pikes, polearms, and there's at least one two-handed sword in there. So notice these are the same military weapons which are described in Giacomo di Grassi's fencing treatise of 1570. So in other words, the military equipment of Scottish soldiers in this period was more or less the same as other Western European countries, with some small local touches to the design and the fashion, but nothing really that was significantly different from other Western European countries. Okay, this final image is one of my own photographs. So this is a display in the National Museum of Scotland here in Edinburgh. So it shows two swords which were recovered from the Borders, so that is the southernmost region of Scotland. And they both date from the late 16th century. The sword on the left is a swept-hilt rapier of the style which had been developed in Italy and which was also very popular in France. And on the right, we have a basket-hilted sword, which is basically identical to the sort of weapon that was common and that had been pioneered down in England. In other words, the sort of sword which the likes of George Silver were big fans of. So I think this picture and these two designs of sword basically give us a big clue as to what was happening in Scotland, particularly when we combine it with all of the political and military history that we discussed earlier. So most likely there were two strands of fencing, if you like, being practiced in Scotland. Some kind of cut and thrust fencing with basket-hilted swords. Probably similar to the sort of thing being described by George Silver, and some kind of thrust-oriented fencing with the rapier, which had been imported from the continent and was most likely Italianate in style. So that's pretty much as close as we can get to identifying the types of fencing practiced in Renaissance Scotland in the 16th century. Okay, so in summary, we can't be 100% sure what type of fencing was practiced in 16th century Scotland, but most likely it followed the same sort of pattern or fashion that was happening in England, south of the border at that time, which means people were probably doing a combination of some kind of cut and thrust fencing, which was typical of the British Isles at that time, in combination with new styles of thrust-oriented fencing imported from the continent, particularly from France and Italy, and most likely that basically means Italian rapier fencing, particularly amongst the elites of society. So there you go, that's my opinion on the topic anyway. There is a lack of primary sources, but hopefully it's interesting for you anyway. Take care everyone, I'll see you again soon. Bye.